The wind came across the plains like a blade, sharp and restless, carrying with it the dust of a land that had known more failure than promise. Jacob Turner kept his shoulders hunched against it, the brim of his battered hat drawn low to shield his eyes from the grit. The wagon creaked under the weight of half-empty barrels and a child's wooden toy wedged between sacks of cornmeal, a reminder of the small boy waiting at home. Every mile of prairie behind him felt heavier than the wagon itself, but he urged the mules forward, because stopping meant surrender, and surrender was something he had sworn never to let take him, not after everything he had already lost. Jacob was not a man of many words. Hardship had stripped language from him piece by piece, until silence seemed less a choice and more a shield. His wife had been the last soul who understood the deeper things he never spoke. Fever had taken her swiftly, leaving him with nothing but a hollow bed, a frightened child, and a house where laughter had dried up like water in a drought. Since that day, Jacob had moved like a man with his feet stuck in the mud of grief, always pushing forward but never breaking free. His farm, once promising, now stood on the edge of ruin, stalks of corn brittle, fences sagging, livestock reduced to a fraction of what they had been. He knew the creditors would come soon, and with them the possibility of losing everything that bore his name. Yet the thought that gnawed deepest was the boy's eyes, too young to be carrying shadows, too innocent to understand why his father sometimes stared into nothing. The train whistle reached him before the station came into sight, a long cry that cut through the endless sky. Jacob's hands tightened on the reins. He wasn't traveling for company or adventure. He was there for business alone. Supplies, debts, and nothing more. He had never believed the station would bring anything else, though men spoke of it as a doorway to new beginnings, where brides stepped from iron carriages to meet husbands they had only known through letters. Jacob had no heart for such arrangements. He had buried his wife with his promise, and even though loneliness pressed against him in the long nights, he had told himself he would not replace her. But promises and needs are seldom equal, and he knew life had a way of forcing men into choices they swore they'd never make. The station was already bustling when Jacob arrived, its wooden platform slick with soot from the locomotive that hissed like a creature catching its breath. Settlers crowded the place, men in rough coats, women clutching shawls against the smoke, children darting through legs with eyes wide at the sight of the engine. Jacob tied off the mules, his gaze steady, searching not for faces but for the clerk who handled accounts. Yet his attention caught on the group gathered near the train steps. A line of women, their dresses wrinkled from travel, their expressions a fragile mixture of hope and fear, waited for the men who had written for them. Names were called, hands extended, hesitant smiles exchanged. There was laughter, awkward but genuine, and the crowd murmured with curiosity. It was not Jacob's world, and he would have passed it by had he not seen what happened next. A woman remained standing after the others had been claimed. She was younger than Jacob expected, perhaps mid-20s, with soft brown hair pinned back too tightly and a traveling dress that strained against her figure. Her trunk sat beside her, scuffed but neatly fastened, as if she had prepared herself with care for a future that had just crumbled in front of her. A man approached, broad-shouldered, well-dressed for the frontier, and for a moment relief lit her face. She stepped forward, her lips parting as though she meant to greet him, but the man's eyes narrowed with open disdain. He shook his head, muttered something harsh, and turned away. The sound of his boots on the platform was louder than her silence, louder than the train's hiss. Then came the whispers, the ugly laughter, words flung like stones. Too fat. No wonder he walked off, poor fool of a girl. The woman's shoulders drew inward, her hands tightening around the handle of a trunk until her knuckles whitened. She kept her chin lifted. But Jacob saw the tremor in her jaw, the effort it took not to crumble in front of them. It was a look he recognized, the look of someone trying to stand tall while the ground beneath them gave way. He told himself to keep walking, to mind his purpose, but something in the moment clung to him. It wasn't her humiliation that caught him. It was a defiance in the face of it, the silent refusal to run or weep even as the cruelty mounted. Jacob had seen many kinds of strength, most forged in sweat or blood, but this was different, quieter, and it stirred something long buried. The clerk's voice broke through the murmur, calling Jacob's name for his account, but his steps slowed. He thought of his son, waiting at home with questions Jacob never answered. He thought of the empty chair across the table, the silence that stretched between the walls each night. He thought of the farm he could not keep alive on his own, of the creditors waiting like wolves at the edge of his fields. He thought, Two, of the way the men had turned their backs on the woman as if she were nothing but wasted flesh, and how she had not bowed. All of it weighed on him in a single breath. When the last of the laughter faded and the crowd began to drift, the woman was left standing alone, trunk at her side, eyes fixed on the horizon as if it might give her an answer. Jacob stepped forward before his mind had fully agreed to it. His boot struck the platform with a heaviness that made her glance up. For a moment, neither spoke. Her eyes, wide and dark, measured him carefully, as though bracing for another wound. Jacob removed his hat, held it against his chest, and spoke with a voice rough from disuse. He said, the words simple yet carrying the weight of choice. You've been wronged. No one should be left standing like this. He paused, feeling the strangeness of what he was about to say, the way his tongue stumbled over something his heart had already decided. I'm a widower. My boy needs a home that doesn't echo. I can't offer much, but I can offer my name, if you'd take it. The platform seemed to hold its breath. The woman blinked, her hand tightening on the trunk handle, her lips parting in disbelief. She studied him, searching his face for mockery or pity, finding neither. What she saw instead was weariness carved deep into the lines around his mouth, sorrow shadowing his eyes, but beneath it all, an honesty that could not be feigned. She exhaled slowly, and when she finally spoke, her voice trembled with a mixture of fear and resolve. My name is Clara, she said, as though offering more than just words, as though revealing herself to a man who had not asked but somehow needed to know. Jacob nodded once. He did not smile, but something softened in him, something that had been stone for too long. He extended his hand, rough and scarred from years of toil. She looked at it, hesitated, then placed her own in his. The moment was awkward, unpolished, yet it carried a weight neither could ignore. The clerk cleared his throat, surprised but efficient. Papers were drawn, signatures scratched, and in the hum of the station a union was sealed. Not with love, not with tender vows, but with necessity, defiance, and the faintest spark of possibility. As Jacob guided Clara from the platform toward his wagon, whispers followed them, a mixture of ridicule and disbelief. Yet neither turned back. Clara's chin lifted higher, and Jacob's stride grew steadier, as if each step pressed a decision deeper into the earth beneath them. The mule shifted restlessly, sensing the change of weight as the trunk was loaded, the boards groaning as though the wagon itself recognized a new burden and a new chance. Jacob took the reins. Clara seated beside him, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The silence between them was not empty but thick with unspoken questions, doubts, and fragile hope. The train whistled again, long and mournful, echoing across the horizon like a warning or a blessing. Jacob did not know if the choice he had made was wisdom or folly. He only knew that the road before him had changed. Clara, once abandoned, now sat at his side, and with her came the promise of conflict and possibility, of struggle shared rather than borne alone. For the first time in a long while, Jacob felt the weight of his life shift, not lighter, but different, as if a new story had begun to write itself with every turn of the wheels. The wheels groaned over the rutted earth, the wagon swaying as if it too carried the uncertainty of those seated upon it. Jacob kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, rein steady in his hands, though inside he was less sure than the mules that pulled him forward. Clara sat beside him, her posture stiff, hands folded tightly in her lap, the trunk that carried all her worldly belongings wedged between sacks of grain at their feet. The silence pressed as heavily as the summer heat, broken only by the creak of wood and the occasional bray of a mule straining against the traces. Jacob had once believed silence a companion, but with Clara it carried weight, like words unsaid filling the space between them until breathing itself felt cautious. The first night they made camp by a stand of cottonwoods, the fire crackling while the prairie hummed with unseen life. Jacob tended the flames with the care of a man who understood how easily darkness swallowed the unprepared. Clara spread her blanket with deliberate precision, as though each fold of fabric could give her a measure of control over a life that had been seized and redirected by another's hand. She did not complain, though Jacob saw the hesitation in her movements, the strain in her back from long hours of riding. He wondered what thoughts flickered behind her downcast eyes, resentment, resignation, or something else altogether. When he handed her a tin plate with beans and cornbread, she accepted it with a nod but no words. Jacob respected that. He knew better than to press for talk when a person was measuring their own resolve. They ate in quiet rhythm, the crack of firewood and the distant howl of coyotes filling the gaps. Yet when his boy's toy fell from the wagon where it had been wedged, tumbling into the date, it was Clara who reached for it first. She brushed the dust away with tender hands, holding it a moment longer than necessary before setting it back where it belonged. Jacob noticed but said nothing. Days passed under skies that swung between scorching sun and sudden storms. The land tested them with every mile. Once, the mules balked at a swollen river crossing, the current roaring with recent rain. Jacob climbed down, boots sinking in the mud, urging the beast forward with a patience born from years of labor. The wagon lurched dangerously, water slapping at its wheels, and Clara clutched the sideboard so tightly her knuckles paled. She made no cry, but when the wheel dipped and Jacob nearly lost his footing, she lunged without thought, gripping the back of his shirt with surprising strength, steadying him until the wagon found solid ground again. Their eyes met in the aftermath, breath mingling with the river's roar, and for the first time Jacob glimpsed something in her gaze that was not just fear, it was determination. The prairie nights brought their own perils. One evening, as the fire burned low, Jacob noticed shadows moving beyond the circle of light. His hand went instinctively to the rifle propped against the wagon. Clara froze, her plate of half-eaten food balanced in her lap. The shadows drew closer, wolves, eyes glinting like coals in the darkness. Jacob rose slowly, rifle in hand, the weight of the weapon familiar but heavy in the still air. The wolves lingered, low growls curling from their throats, but when Jacob fired a warning shot into the date, they scattered into the tall grass. Clara exhaled sharply, only then realizing she had been holding her breath. She glanced at Jacob, gratitude flickering in her eyes, though she quickly looked away as if ashamed to reveal it. Not all threats came with fangs. On the fifth day, the sun blazing mercilessly overhead, a group of riders appeared on the ridge, their figures sharp against the sky. Jacob's gut tightened. He recognized the careless posture, the laughter that carried across the wind. Bandits! They descended swiftly, circling the wagon like vultures. The leader, a man with a scar splitting his lip, grinned with cool amusement as his gaze slid to Clara. His words were coarse, his intentions plain, and Jacob felt the old fire rise in his chest. He stood his ground, rifle steady, though his hands trembled from more than heat. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and he knew it, yet surrender was not in him. Before violence erupted, another figure appeared, a solitary rider, lean and silent, emerging from the tall grass like part of the earth itself. His horse moved with quiet grace, his presence commanding without words. The bandits faltered, exchanging uneasy glances. The stranger did not draw a weapon, but the weight of his gaze was enough. With muttered curses, the bandits retreated, spitting dust as they rode off. The stranger lingered only a moment longer, his eyes sweeping over Jacob and Clara, then turned his horse and vanished as swiftly as he had come. That night, Jacob sat by the fire longer than usual, staring into the flames. Clara, wrapped in her blanket, finally broke the silence. "Who was he?" she asked, her voice low, hesitant. Jacob shook his head. "A man who owes us nothing," he replied, "but for some reason chose not to leave us to wolves of another kind." Clara absorbed his words, her expression unreadable, but Jacob noticed the way her shoulders eased ever so slightly, as though knowing they were not entirely alone on that vast plain. The days that followed tested them in quieter, more insidious ways. Heat bore down, lips cracked, and the water barrel grew lighter with each sip. Jacob's son weighed heavily on his mind, the boy too young to fend for himself at home, too dependent on a father who was often absent in more ways than one. Clara, sensing the turmoil he never voiced, took it upon herself to ease a burden she could. She gathered firewood without being asked, mended a tear in his coat, and once, when Jacob's hands trembled from exhaustion, she steadied the reins, guiding the wagon across rough ground until his strength returned. These were small gestures, but they carved space in the silence between them, shifting it from emptiness into something approaching companionship. One afternoon, as they rested in the shade of a solitary oak, Jacob overheard voices carried on the wind. He rose cautiously, motioning Clara to stay hidden. 2 settlers passed nearby, speaking of trouble brewing in the territory, raids, feuds, debts gone unpaid. The mention of creditors stung Jacob like a lash, a reminder of the noose tightening around his farm. Clara watched him as he returned, his jaw set hard, his silence deeper than before. She did not press him, but that night, when he thought she slept, she whispered into the darkness, "You are not the only one carrying shame." Her words were soft, not meant for his ears, yet they reached him all the same. The bond between them deepened through trial, though not without fracture. One evening, Jacob muttered within earshot that Clara might slow him down, that he had made a choice too hastily. The words were born of fatigue and fear, but they cut like a blade. Clara's eyes hardened, her pride wounded more deeply than any insult thrown at her by strangers. She withdrew into herself, movements clipped, her silence colder than before. Jacob regretted the words almost instantly, but apologies were foreign to him, and so he carried the weight of them in silence. The reckoning came when his son's toy fell again from the wagon, this time tumbling into the tall grass near stream. Clara retrieved it, but as she turned back, she heard the boy's name spoken aloud by Jacob in a rare, soft tone, as though summoning the child's spirit. Then came the rattling hiss of a snake coiled in the grass. Clara froze, heart pounding, the toy clutched in her hand. The serpent struck, but she swung the wooden plaything with desperate strength, knocking the creature aside before it could sink fangs into her leg. Jacob rushed to her, rifle in hand, but it was Clara's quick reflex that had spared them both. She stood trembling, breath ragged, the toy splintered but still whole. She handed it back to Jacob without a word. For the first time, he looked at her not as a burden but as a partner, her courage undeniable. That night, he spoke more than he had in weeks. He told her of his wife, of the fever that had stolen her, of the promises he had failed to keep. Clara listened, her eyes reflecting the firelight, her silence a balm rather than a judgment. When he faltered, she placed her hand on his, steady, firm. "You are not the only one who has lost," she said quietly. "But loss is not the end. It's the ground we build upon, if we dare." The prairie stretched before them still, filled with perils both seen and unseen, but something had shifted. They were no longer strangers bound by desperation alone. They had begun to stitch the tatters of their separate griefs into a fabric strong enough to bear weight. Jacob still doubted, still feared, but now he looked at Clara with a faint recognition of someone who might help him weather the storms. And Clara, though scarred by rejection and haunted by the echoes of cruel laughter, began to see herself not as abandoned but as chosen. When the wagon rolled on the next morning, the silence between them was different. It no longer pressed down like a burden. It carried the quiet possibility of something yet unspoken, something taking root in the spaces hardship had hollowed out. The land ahead promised trials, and Jacob knew the path would only grow harsher, but for the first time in a long while, he felt the faintest thread of hope binding him to another soul. The homestead stood like a wounded animal against the vastness of the plains, its roof sagging, fences broken in places, and fields lying bare where crops had withered under sun and storm alike. Jacob guided the wagon into the yard with a heaviness in his chest, the sight of what had once been his hope now a reminder of his failures. Clara sat beside him, her expression unreadable, though her eyes lingered on every detail. The leaning barn, the tired mule tied near the gate, the faint smoke curling from a chimney where Jacob's son waited. She said nothing, but Jacob sensed her thoughts, the way she measured the ruin against the man who had brought her here. He braced for judgment, but none came, only a quiet resolve that unsettled him more than disdain might have. The boy came running, his hair tousled, cheeks flushed with excitement that his father's return always brought. He slowed when he saw Clara, his small face narrowing with confusion. Jacob crouched, his rough hand resting on the boy's shoulder. "This is Clara," he said, his voice steady though his stomach twisted. "She'll be staying with us now." The boy looked at her with the blunt honesty only children possess. Clara lowered herself to his height, offering a small smile. From her pocket she pulled the wooden toy, mended where she had bound a splintered crack with cloth. She held it out. The boy hesitated, then took it, his fingers brushing hers in a gesture that carried more acceptance than words. Jacob watched, his throat tight, realizing she had already found a way to speak to his son where he often failed. The days that followed were harder than Jacob had expected. The farm was failing faster than he could repair it, creditors circling closer with each week. Neighbors came by, curiosity sharpened their eyes, whispers trailing behind them like dust. Clara endured the stays, the muttered remarks about her size, her city clothes, her unlikely place in Jacob Turner's life. Yet instead of retreating, she threw herself into the work. She patched fences with stubborn hands, milked a lone cow without flinching, and planted what few seeds they had left with a determination that seemed to defy the very oath. Jacob watched her, at first with suspicion, then with reluctant respect. She rose before the sun, her skirts damp with dew, and when the day ended, she still carried herself with the dignity of someone who refused to be broken. One evening, as Jacob mended a gate by lantern light, he saw a figure watching from the tree line. The stranger from the prairie, Hawk, though Jacob did not yet know his name, stood silent, his presence both unsettling and reassuring. Jacob lifted a hand in greeting, uncertain of what to say. Hawk nodded once, then stepped forward, speaking few words but offering help. Over the days that followed, he showed them where the soil still held moisture, how to track the signs of predators near the livestock, how to set snares for small game when supplies ran thin. His ways were quiet, his movements precise, and though he rarely explained himself, his guidance saved him more than once. Jacob learned to listen without pride, and Clara learned to thank him with the warmth of her presence. A bowl of stew left at his camp, a quilt patched with care. Hawk became less of an enigma and more of an ally, though his silence never lifted entirely. Trouble returned one night, as the wind carried the scent of smoke from the west. Jacob's unease grew until hooves thundered against the gate, bandits emerging under the cover of darkness. It was the same men who had circled them before, eyes mean, guns glinting in the moonlight. They rode into the yard with cruel laughter, demanding food, money, and worse. Clara stood near the door, her body tense, shielding Jacob's son with an instinct that was fiercer than fear. Jacob raised his rifle, his jaw clenched, but he knew the odds were against him. The bandits jeered, one stepping closer, his gaze crawling toward Clara with a hunger that made Jacob's blood boil. The fight erupted with a single shot. The yard filled with smoke and shouts, bullets splintering wood, firelight flashing against steel. Jacob fought like a man cornered, each breath drawn between the hammer and roar of his rifle. Clara pulled the boy to safety, but when one of the bandits broke through the door, she seized a cast-iron skillet from the stove and struck him with all her strength. The man crumpled, his weapon falling to the floor. She stood trembling, chest heaving, but her eyes were steady, no longer the eyes of someone abandoned, but of someone claiming her place. Hawk appeared from the darkness like a shadow given flesh, his arrows finding their marks with deadly precision. The bandits faltered, retreating under the weight of unexpected resistance. When the last had fled, silence fell heavy, broken only by the crackle of fire from a lantern struck during the fray. Jacob lowered his rifle, sweat and blood mingling on his brow. Clara stood in the doorway, the boy clinging to her skates, her body framed by the flickering light. In that moment, Jacob saw her not as a burden taken on in pity, but as a partner who had stood when others might have fled. The aftermath left the homestead scarred, splintered boards, shattered glass, livestock scattered, but it also left something new between them. That night, Jacob sat beside Clara on the steps, the boy asleep inside. The air was cool, the stars sharp against the dark. He turned to her, his voice low, hesitant. "You saved us," he said. She shook her head. "We saved each other." Her words lingered in the night, simple but heavy with truth. For the first time since his wife's death, Jacob felt the knot in his chest loosen. He had thought himself alone in his burden, but now he understood that strength could be shared, and in sharing, it grew. In the days that followed, life did not miraculously soften. The farm still struggled, creditors still loomed, and the land still tested them with every dawn. Yet within the walls of the worn house, there was laughter now, tentative but real. Clara read stories to the boy at night, her voice filling the rooms where silence had once reigned. Jacob found himself listening, not just to her word, but to the cadence of hope stitched between them. Hawk came and went as quietly as the wind, leaving behind snares full of rabbits or tools carved from his own hand. Each gift was wordless, but each spoke volumes. Jacob began to see Clara differently. Where once he had noticed only the weight of her body, now he saw the strength in her shoulders as she lifted buckets of water, the steadiness in her hands as she sewed by lamplight, the courage in her eyes when storms rattled the windows. She was not what the world had mocked her for being. She was more, far more, than the cool measure of appearances. She was resilience embodied, and in her reflection, Jacob found the courage to face his own brokenness. One evening, as they stood together watching the sun bleed into the horizon, Jacob spoke the words he had carried silently since the station. "I thought I was offering you a home out of pity," he admitted, "but it's me who's been given one. You filled it with something I thought I'd lost forever." Clara's breath caught, her gaze fixed on the horizon, but her hand slipped into his, fingers intertwining with quiet certainty. They stood that way until the stars replaced the sun, not needing more words. The reckoning had not been with bandits or droughts alone, but within themselves. Jacob had faced his grief, his pride, and his fear of needing another. Clara had faced the sting of rejection, the weight of cool words, and found within herself a strength that no insult could diminish. Together, they had forged something fragile but unbreakable, a bond tested by trial and sealed in fire. Their story did not end with riches or ease, but with endurance. The farm remained a place of struggle, yet now it pulsed with a rhythm of shared labor, shared laughter, shared sorrow. Jacob knew there would be more storms, more wolves at the door, but he also knew he would not face them alone. Clara, once abandoned, now stood as the heart of his home, her presence a defiance against the cruelty of a world too quick to dismiss her worth. And so, when the next dawn came, painting the plains in gold, Jacob rose not with the weight of despair but with the quiet strength of a man who had chosen, and been chosen in return. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years it was a road he did not dread walking. For beside him walked Clara, her hand steady in his, her spirit unyielding, her place no longer questioned. The tale leaves us with a question that lingers beyond the firelight in the fields. When the world turns its back, when cruelty strips a person bare, what remains? For Jacob and Clara, it was a choice to see beyond wounds and appearances, to find in one another the courage to endure. And perhaps, in that choice, lies the truest form of love,